this word brand, in most of the other places I go to, and I'm sure to some extent in South Africa as well, has already taken on a strongly negative connotation. And that was beginning to emerge in the conversation this morning. People were starting to say some quite interesting things, like, for example, maybe it's time we started talking about reality instead of just trying to put a glossy coat of paint over the problems. The strong implication being that that's what branding is. Branding is putting lipstick on a pig, as I can't remember whether it was Sarah Palin or Barack Obama who used the phrase, but it's an old phrase and a good one. Well, I'm not here to defend branding. In fact, I'm here to attack it, and if possible, to destroy it. As you see me standing here on the stage today, you may or may not notice that I was followed here, as I was followed everywhere I go, by an ugly, lame, limping dog. The name of this dog is Nation Brand. It's been trailing after me for the last 15 years or so. And wherever I go, people look at me and they say, "Nice dog you've got there." And I turn around to them and say, "A," which is not a nice way of answering a polite compliment. A, it is not a nice dog. It's an ugly, lame, limping brute. And B, it's not mine. So every opportunity I get in public to turn around and shoot the damn thing, I do it. And that's what I'm now going to do, I hope rather briefly. I never ever coined the phrase nation brand. I'm frequently accused of having done so, and it's a lie. The phrase I may accidentally have coined in the paper way back in about 1996 was the really, I promise you, take my word for it, very different phrase, nation brand. Now you may say, what difference can three letters possibly make? Well, they make a difference. In the paper that I wrote back in 1997 or 8 or whenever it was, which kicked this whole hysteria off, I called this paper Nation Brands of the 21st Century. And what I was talking about was what seems to me now to be a rather obvious observation. I'm sure it will seem very obvious to you as well, but you'll have to believe me that in 1998 it was not so obvious. Globalization has turned the world into a single marketplace to many effects. And one of the consequences of that change is that every place, every country, every continent, every region, every city, every town, every village finds itself competing for what's going with every other place. And what's going? Well, what's going is tourists, talent, investment, the attention and the respect of the international media, the attention and the respect of other governments and of other populations. There's only one superpower left on the planet, and that superpower is called public opinion. It is the only power on the planet, and it dictates virtually everything. So my argument in this paper was simply this. Countries, for a start, are in a very crowded marketplace as a result of these forces of globalization. This is not like selling soap powder on a supermarket shelf, where you're perhaps in competition with 2 or at most 3 other brands of soap powder. This particular supermarket shelf, which is all the countries on Earth, last time I checked, contained about 203 competing varieties of country. In a situation like that, your reputation, your standing, your image, your brand, if you must, becomes virtually everything. Why? Because nobody knows anything about the reality. Nobody knows anything about other countries. When I survey the Nation Brands Index, which I've been doing since 2005, it's a large-scale poll of international public opinion about countries. I sometimes call it the index of ignorance. I ask about 29,000 of my closest friends in 30 different countries what they think about 50 other countries. And most of the time, what they tell me is that what they think about most other countries is virtually nothing. In fact, one of the things that this survey has told me, and it's a chilling fact, is that most people only ever think about 3 countries. Their own, a little bit. Not a lot, a little bit. The United States of America, because it's kind of there, and you can't avoid it. And it does have some kind of relevance to most people at various points in their lives. And then the third one is whichever country happens to be personally relevant to them aside from their country of origin at any given moment. The place where perhaps their daughter is trying to get a job overseas, the place where they fancy going on holiday next year or they went last year, or perhaps this week's pariah state, the one that's in the news because of the awful things that are going on there. That's it. 3 countries. Now, what that effectively means is that the other 202 countries, or however many it is, effectively don't exist. And so when I get a country coming to me and saying, please make us famous, I find it difficult to stifle my cynical laughter. Because which of those 3? Let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, this is Guatemala. I can say Guatemala because they never have spoken to me, and so I'm not maligning anybody. Guatemala is a lovely country. But supposing it was Guatemala and they said, so how can we be famous? My temptation would be to say, so which country are you going to take out? Guatemala. Are you going to take out the United States? Are you going to become more notorious than Zimbabwe or Afghanistan? Or are you going to somehow become more important to people out there than their own native land? I just don't see it. Now, whenever I talk, I'm afraid I have to start with this very, very cold shower. I think that it is extraordinarily important when trying to grasp these issues that one grasps them with a large dose of humility. It is a famous old trick of the public relations industry to treat the subject with hubris and arrogance, and to talk glibly about manipulating public opinion, and to say, we'll send out a few press releases, we'll get some column inches, and we'll change what people think. I think that one has to approach public opinion, especially international public opinion, with a great deal more humility than that, and to recognize what an extraordinarily powerful and immovable force it is. It is much closer to a force of nature than a force of humanity. It's like a volcano, like a tidal wave, like an earthquake. You don't stand there arguing with it, you just get out of the way. So I think that dose of humility is really important. Let's not kid ourselves for a moment that there's some magic formula from the corporate sector called branding, or marketing, or advertising, or PR, or whatever else, that can somehow change what the world thinks about a country. But I digress. I was talking about this tedious paper I wrote. The point I made was a simple observation that in these circumstances, countries have got their images, and those images are terribly important. I even ventured so far as to say that they were more important than the reality, because everybody knows the perception, and very few people know the reality. I went further still. I said that what this means is that it is the task of responsible government in the 21st century for them to be almost as much brand managers as they are policymakers. Why did I say that? Well, because the nation's most valuable, most precious asset is its good name. If you're a country with a good, strong, powerful reputation like Sweden, everything you do is easy and everything you do is cheap. You want tourists? Well, they already want to come to Sweden. You only have to remind them politely that you're there and they'll come. You want investors? They're already queuing up. You only have to remind them politely that you're going to make it pretty easy for them. If you've got a good, powerful, and positive reputation, it benefits every single sector of society. It benefits the population. If you're Swedish and you want to go and get a job in some other country, people will treat you just exactly the same way as if you were trying to get a job and you handed in your business card and it said Simon Anholt, stationery purchaser, Microsoft. They immediately assume that you're kind of okay because if Microsoft hired you, you must be. And if by the same token it says Simon Anholt, Sweden, people will think that you're honest, you're well educated, you're polite, you're tall, you're blonde, and you're good looking, despite all the evidence. But hey, that's the benefit of a good name. In fact, that point about hiring people from other countries, the point about how people carry their own country of origin on them like an odious little label on the back of their garments, is very well illustrated by a particular question which I asked in the Nation Banks Index. I say to people, imagine that you're the boss of a corporation and you've got to hire a senior executive. And imagine that you've got 2 equally qualified candidates in front of you. Equally qualified. They've both got exactly the same qualifications. They're the same age, the same salary expectations. They are both polite, well-dressed, good-looking, and enthusiastic. They've got the same experience. The only difference between them is, for example, one of them comes from Sweden and the other one comes from Turkey. Now, I can hear some people sniggering away. And we'll find out why. Because 70% of my sample say that they would rather hire in Sweden. Now, 70% is a figure you don't often get in a public opinion poll. That's a very, very high number. That means that virtually everybody who is sentient and actually paying attention to filling out the form really believes that very profoundly indeed. This is a sample which represents about 65% of the world's population and about 70% of its spending power. So this is pretty representative. What's even more concerning than that is the fact that 80% of the Turks would rather hire in Sweden. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't find that a subject for laughter. If I were Turkish, and I've spoken many, many times to the Turkish government on this particular matter, that's such a worry. And one of the things I really don't want to do is to make facile comparisons between branding in the corporate sector and this idiot idea called nation branding. But hell, there is a comparison there. Because every corporate person who knows anything about branding will tell you that the stakeholders, the staff, have got to live the brand. They've got to believe in it. And if your own population would rather hire a foreigner than hire somebody from your own country, am I allowed to use a bad word in South Africa? So one of the things that one has to look at here, and it's been said over and over and over again, is that in the end, when you're talking about external perceptions of a country, the first thing you've got to look at is internal perceptions. So I said before, and I'll say it again, the country's good name is by a very wide margin its most valuable asset. And I reckon that it's the responsibility of any government when it comes into office to cherish the privilege they have of looking after that asset. And their job is to hand it down to their successors in office in at least as good condition as they received it. Thus, Nelson Mandela goes down in history as a great leader because he inherited the brand South Africa of apartheid and he handed down the Rainbow Nation. Thus, George W. Bush goes down in history as a bad leader because he inherited a brand America which had taken 350 years of careful and deliberate building. And he handed it down to Obama, apparently in shreds and tatters. Now I say apparently because it proved not to be the case. And the moment that Obama stepped into the White House, America, at least in my survey, shot straight back up to #1 again. I've never seen anything like it, and I don't suppose I'll ever see anything like it ever again. But I might come back to that later on if I give myself enough time. The point about the paper was simply this. Countries have images, and they depend on those images. And it's therefore really very important for government to understand its role, not as the owner of that brand image, but at least as the custodian of it, and their responsibility to protect it. A thing I said in a paper some years later, but which I've had cause to read again and wonder about again recently, is this. If the governments of the world placed half as much value as the bosses of wise corporations do on their image, then the world would be a safer and quieter place than it is today. You don't very often hear of Vodafone going and buying a bunch of machine guns and invading O2. Do you? And there are several reasons for that, let's be honest, but one of the reasons at least is because Vodafone know that their license to trade, the value of their brand, their connection with their consumer depends to some degree on the way that they behave and are seen to behave by their consumers. They have a duty of good behavior. What a wonderful world this would be if all governments treated the image of their country with the same care that the bosses of corporations treat their brand image. In reality, we know that foreign relations isn't really like that. You don't often have choices. I would have loved to have rung up Tony Blair on the morning that we decided to invade Iraq and said to him, Tony, think of the brand. The reality, I suspect, is that it wouldn't have made an enormous amount of difference because, as any of you who have ever been involved in foreign policy making decisions know, most of the time there isn't a choice, and all you can really do is figure out the best way to spin it to public opinion afterwards. Nonetheless, the principle is a good one. So that was the paper, and you'll notice that the phrase, the word that I used all the way through was brand, the brand of the nation. And I was talking about brand image. I was not talking about branding. I have no idea what branding is. I think it's the most dishonest, deceitful, empty, boastful, dangerous word in the English language. I just don't even know what it means. And some people seem to think I'm supposed to know about this kind of stuff. But I'll come back to that. There's something else that I want to tell you about first. And that's the difference between brand image and brand identity. Throughout the conversation this morning, there was endless confusion between two entirely separate definitions of that word brand. And we've really got to be rigorous about this. I'd be inclined to make a rule that says you're not allowed to use the word brand on its own. Be specific. What do you mean? Do you mean brand image or do you mean brand identity? Brand identity is something pretty simple and pretty straightforward. It's the thing that's on this bottle here. Santon Convention Centre. A lovely little logo and certain colours and certain fonts. A child of 6 could do this. Right? You have absolute, if you are at the Santon Convention Centre, you have absolute control over what appears on that bottle. You can mess with it to your heart's content. You can blow as much money on designing and redesigning it as you like. That's the brand identity. That's what branding agencies call branding. It's the design of the packaging of the product. It has no exact analogy when we're talking about places, because places, thank God, don't have logos. They have flags. They certainly don't need logos, in my opinion, but that's another subject altogether. Brand image is something entirely different. Brand image is what I think about Santon Convention Centre mineral water. I'm not sure what I think about it, but if I had a view, that would be the brand image. The brand image is not the message. It's the context in which your messages are received. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's imagine a scenario where we've got two airlines, and one has got a very good brand image and the other one's got a very bad brand image. The one with a very bad brand image, let's say, just for the sake of argument, is Aeroflot, okay? Now, Aeroflot is actually quite a good airline these days, but they still suffer from the fact that they've had a checkered past, and the brand is not particularly positive. And let's imagine a scenario, an imaginary scenario, where the president of Aeroflot decides that it's time to improve the brand. So he gets all of his managers and senior directors and sends them out into the world to look at what the competition are doing. He says, go out, look at these other airlines with their great brand images, find out what it is that they're doing right and we're doing wrong. So they go away, and a week later the first one comes back after her tour of inspection of the competition, and she says, boss, I've discovered what it is. And he says, what is it, what is it? And she says, well, boss, the other airlines, you see, they don't crash. And so she gets fired, and then the second guy comes back and says, boss, I've got it. And the boss says, this had better be good. And he says, boss, it's good. You see, the other airlines, part of the reason they've got such a great brand image is because they have flat beds these days in their business class. And boss, we don't have business class. So the boss says, that's it. We're going to do that. But because we're Aeroflot, we're going to go one better than everybody else, and we're not just going to have flat beds in business class, we're going to have flat double beds in business class. And so the whole fleet is totally redesigned and rebuilt inside out, and they create this wonderful business class cabin, and they make these beautiful, huge, wide, flat, bridal beds. And the president calls a press conference, and he announces before the world's media, breathless hush. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to announce that from next month you can fly in Aeroflot's new business class and you can sleep with a friend. So what's the reaction in the press conference? Well, what's your reaction? I don't know. My reaction? Horror. I don't want to sleep with a friend on Aeroflot. I don't want to sleep on Aeroflot. I want to sit bolt upright with my seat back in the upright position and my boots laced up to my knees until we land, so I can then throw myself down the stairs and kiss the ground because we've arrived in one piece. That's how much I want bridal beds in business. And let's just imagine the other scenario where we have the airline with the good brand, and let's say that the good brand in this case is Virgin Atlantic. A visitor to this place. And let's just imagine that Richard Branson, the chief executive of Virgin, with his woolly beard and his woolly jumper, stands up at the press release and says pretty much the same thing. And let's imagine he says, ladies and gentlemen, from next month you can fly Virgin's new upper class. You can sleep with a friend. And what's the reaction? Well, we don't have to imagine the reaction because, of course, he did it. And the reaction was delight. Everybody said, fantastic, how cool, how funky, how sexy, how British, how virgin. Where do I buy my ticket? You see, it's precisely the opposite reaction to precisely the same message. That's brand image. So what does it tell you? It tells you, first of all, that you have absolutely no control over this damn thing. This is what I mean by humility. When marketers talk about conditioning the drivers of behavior, as if they could get a little screwdriver and open people's skulls and fix what people think about Virgin Atlantic. Richard Branson would love to do that, but he can't. So the brand image is in a secure location to which you have no access. The image of South Africa is in a secure location to which you have no access. The second thing you realize is that it's in a remote location. The brand image of Virgin Atlantic doesn't reside in Richard Branson's aeroplanes or in his offices. It resides in the minds of his millions upon millions of consumers around the world. So the brand image is in a remote, secure location. And thirdly, and most devastatingly, it's actually not even in one place where you can get it. It's in a million places. Every single one of those consumers has a different notion in his or her head about Virgin Atlantic, depending on their race, their sex, their culture, their age, their expectations, their experiences, and so on and so on and so on. So the brand image sits in a remote, secure, fragmented location, and to talk about it as if you could just go in there with your little screwdriver and fix it is nonsense. And that's why I dislike the word branding. Branding is a lie which has been perpetrated by the branding industry in an effort to try to create the illusory idea that there is a shortcut to a better brand image. That you can do a thing called branding which somehow makes people think better stuff about it. Already? I hardly started. You're not telling me I've spoken for 40 minutes. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to speak for 40 minutes. The concomitant of that is that this is a thing which one has to approach with a due amount of humility. When it comes to a corporation, that's the amount of humility it needs. When you're talking about a country or a continent, then the thing becomes completely preposterous. So let us forget about the idea of branding South Africa. Let us forget about the idea of branding Africa. Yes? Branding is something that is done by public opinion. If a brand is something which is a silly, childish, simple, naive stereotype of a country or a continent, Africa is about poverty, that's the brand of Africa. Japan is about miniaturization. France is about chic. We don't want these childish stereotypes. For a government to be thinking about branding its own country, to be labeling it with an idiotic, simple, one-way, two-dimensional, childish stereotype like that, is an act of unforgivable cultural violence against its own population. We shouldn't be thinking of doing that. What we should be thinking of doing is something much closer in my mind to education, making sure that everybody knows everything about it. As a country, this is a brand. With all the chaotic contradictions, with all the good and the bad, never a wiser word than that spoken by Trevor and Kube this morning, about the absolute fundamental importance of the media covering the bad as well as the good. Let's not think about image and reputation, let's think about the damn product. I get countries ringing me up almost every week saying, apparently we have a crap reputation, can you help? And do you know what I always say to them? I say, are you perhaps a crap country? And they're always offended when I ask that, but frankly, you've got to ask, haven't you? I mean, that is the most likely explanation for why a country has a poor image, is because it's not a very good country. Now, there are exceptions, of course, and really and truly, many African countries really do not deserve the reputation they have. It's been spoken about before, it's a subject I've been writing about for 20 years, how the so-called continent brand of Africa, vigorously promoted by aid celebrities and by the aid industry, has the noxious effect of branding negatively all the countries underneath it. We know about that, we understand that now. The question is, how do we fight against it? I think the other thing that we've also begun to understand, or at least I've recently begun to understand, is the double-edged blade of aid. Where does this damage come from? Well, so much of it comes from reality, but much of it also comes from the aid industry, which in order to manage to continue to find the funding from taxpayers in rich countries to continue to donate the aid, extracts a very, very high price for that aid. What we do in my country, in the United Kingdom, is when we pick on an African country to help, what we do is we hand over the money, but we take their national image in hostage. for the period of the aid that we give them. We set about professionally degrading it. With all the marketing skills and dollars at our disposal, we make that place look as hopeless as we possibly can. Because that's the only way that we can generate and continue to generate amongst our taxpayers sufficient funds to continue to give the aid. Now, if the aid worked, you could say, well, okay, there's a short-term damage to the reputation, but it's good for the economy. As work by Damiso and many others has categorically demonstrated over the years, the aid doesn't even work. My argument is that the damage done to the reputation will last for generations, because the image of a country that needs charity is fundamentally incompatible with a country that requires investment. I feel sorry for an African country, and so I'll give it money. But because it's a basket case, I'm sure as hell not going to go on holiday there. I'm sure as hell not going to invest in a company there. I'm sure as hell not going to buy any of the stuff they make. And this is the thing which blocks the development of Africa as much, if not more, than any other factor. So how are we going to fight about this? By being amazing. It's the only way. It's the only way. I hear so many conversations in so many countries, and we heard a bit of it this morning, which is basically discussing ways in which you can brag about how wonderful you think you are. It doesn't work because nobody's interested. They just don't care. They're not listening. They only think about 3 other countries. What matters is relevance. Another question I get asked by government so frequently is, what can we say to make ourselves famous? It's an idiot question. There is nothing you can say to make yourselves famous. The only meaningful question is, what can we do to make ourselves relevant? We are lucky enough, folks, to live in an age where rich or poor, black or white, African, European or Asian or American, we all face the same problems. You or I could sit down in 5 minutes, we could write a list of the 40 problems that affect us most, and I swear to God they would be the same problems that people would write down. So the only question that it's worth a country asking, if it wants to be better regarded, is which one of those can I move the needle on as a country? What can we do? What's our contribution? The question I want you to start to learn to ask yourselves is, what's South Africa for? That's the difficult question. We live in an age where every country needs to be able to answer that question. What's our purpose? What were we put on this earth to do? Not what are we aspiring to, not who do we want to follow, but who are we going to lead? Where do we provide leadership? What do we give? Where do we earn the respect and the gratitude of other people for the things that we do and the things that we achieve? South Africa is so typical of developing countries whose eyes are fixed on the countries above them, constantly getting a bloody nose because it fails to impress the countries above them. It shouldn't be looking exclusively in that direction. It should also be looking behind its back and looking at all the countries that do admire. South Africa has got a fantastic brand image in a whole range of valuable countries, important countries, some of them emerging, some of them very poor, a very large number right here in Africa itself. Those are your market, those are your audience. Those are the places where you don't have to worry about your brand because it's already fantastic. And those are the countries where you give and are required to give leadership. And from leadership comes reputation and respect. One of the reasons why I feel unfashionably optimistic these days is because I've started to notice that exactly the same principle as corporate social responsibility is beginning to be exercised at the level of nations. Let's brand it. Let's call it governmental social responsibility. CSR, what's that? Companies noticed a few years ago that unless they gave something back, unless they respected the society in which they were based, unless they looked after their people and the communities in which they were based and the planet, they would not earn the loyalty of their consumers. This was a revolution. You can be cynical about it. You can say that half of them are lying. It's just PR. I don't even care. The fact is that they're doing it. And I'll tell you another thing. It's a delightful fact about human nature that even if you earned your esteem dishonestly in the first place, as soon as you start to win it, you start to treasure it. I've seen organizations do this all the time. They start doing corporate social responsibility and bragging about their environmental credentials, and they're lying through their teeth. They're just doing it because the PR agency told them to. But the moment they start to find that that works, and people are admiring and respecting them for the things that they don't deserve, boy, do they start running to try and deserve it. And do they start trying to defend it? And do they start treasuring it for what it is? So that was a revolution. That was corporate social responsibility. What I see today, as I move around the world, is the same consumers exercising the same ethical judgments on countries as they do on corporations. And why wouldn't they? It's the same kids in Canada who won't buy Reebok training shoes because they believe they're made by children in indentured labour in Thailand, also saying, I'm not going to go on holiday in country X because I don't like the country X government's stance on climate change. We are entering into a world where that sole superpower, consumer power, public opinion, is dictating the moral and ethical terms of power between countries. Are we going to respond to those things? Are we going to look at the areas in which we can give rather than follow, and lead rather than follow? Somebody once said to me, and I promise I will stop now, I feel very rude about this, but I had a few things to say, and I sure as I wasn't going to come all the way from London to say only half of it. I hate it when other people do this to me, but there's a lesson there, isn't there, to be learned. That nasty person is probably you in different circumstances. I think I just said something quite profound, actually. I'll make a note of that later on. Here's the thing I was going to say. People always say to me, so what can a country do, if anything, if it wants to upgrade its reputation, if it wants to have a higher standing in the world? I don't think it's anything to do with marketing. I think marketing at the sectoral level is important. If you've got good products to sell, like tourism, even arguably foreign investment, I think you should market the hell out of it. Tourism is an idiot business. The more money you spend on promoting tourism, the more visitors you'll get. That's so obvious. And you must do that. But at the national level, no. At the national level, that really, really doesn't mean a thing. That's propaganda. When I see a country, I remember sitting in a hotel room once and watching CNN and hearing, in fact it was Yoweri Museveni himself telling me that Uganda was gifted by nature. And I remember thinking to myself, well, okay, so let's just imagine I'm an ignorant Brit. What do I think about Uganda before and after I see that commercial? Before I see the commercial about Uganda, I think to myself, okay, Uganda's in Africa, I think. So it's therefore a poor, desperate, famine-struck, crime-ridden, disease-ridden hellhole somewhere in Africa. And then I see Mr. Museveni telling me that I'm wrong and it's gifted by nature. What am I going to do? Am I going to say, oh, but this has been wrong about Uganda all these years, I'm immediately change my mind? Of course I'm not. I'm going to say, yeah, I was right about Uganda all these years. Not only is it a poor, desperate, famine-struck, disease-ridden hellhole somewhere in Africa, it's obviously even more corrupt than I thought, otherwise where did they steal all the money to this expensive advertising? I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know much about it. We recognise that stuff for what it is. It's government propaganda and we instinctively ignore it because it has no relevance to us. It doesn't mean anything to us. This is not somebody doing honest marketing and saying, buy this, it's good, you might like it, which is what tourism promotion is all about. This is about a foreign government saying, you will change your mind about my country. But why? I'm just not going to pay any attention. So what is necessary? What is necessary, and here's my one-sentence answer, and I'll say it twice because it's a long and difficult sentence. The country has to develop systems and structures and strategies to project a constant, unbroken stream of dramatic evidence that it deserves the reputation it desires. Let's see if I can remember that. A country must develop the systems, the strategies, and the structures to enable it to project a constant, unbroken stream of dramatic evidence that it deserves the reputation it desires. In other words, my friends, proof, proof, and more proof. Never ever stop. South Africa is one of the very few countries in the history of the world that actually has succeeded in improving its standard. It did so after the end of the World Cup. That was more about timing than anything else, but it failed to follow through. Are you failing to follow through after the World Cup? These are not sprints, these are relay races which have to be protracted over generations because nobody cares and nobody's paying attention. And because international public opinion has a mental age of 6, if you're lucky. You have to keep at it for generation upon generation, not talking, not bragging, but proving by being relevant and by doing the stuff that other people need to hear about. It's a relay race. Who has taken the baton after the World Cup? Countries have to become obsessive about asking themselves, what do we do next? What do we do next? What do we do next? Creating a climate of relentless innovation in every sector and every part of the country, where people are brought up to believe that the only good thing, the only true thing they can do is to innovate, to make good new stuff. and to make it world-class. And the job of an international marketing council is threefold. First of all, to encourage at least some fundamental synergy between the sectors, so that they're not spending money against each other and sending out images of South Africa which are contradictory. This they do very well indeed. The second thing, evaluation, monitoring and measurement. This is public funds being spent. It must be transparent, measurable and accountable. I am sickened by the countries that spend government money or donor money on so-called branding campaigns without any effort whatsoever to measure the effectiveness. Nobody is accountable, nobody measures it. It's black magic from the private sector, so it must be wonderful. It must be measured and it must be accountable. Thirdly and finally, to hold government, to hold business and to hold civil society to account, to stop them being boring. The biggest problem in all of this is being boring. Politicians, a breed with whom, for my sins, I spend most of my life, have a big problem. Mostly they're lovely people. Mostly they're very serious. But they have a tendency to confuse seriousness with boringness. Because the subjects they're dealing with every day are so very, very serious, they fall into the fatal trap of thinking that they also have to be boring. This is a desperate error. Because the one thing a responsible government cannot possibly be, and corporations know this very well, is boring. Because if you're boring, nobody cares, nobody notices, nobody buys, nobody remembers. So the task of an international marketing council is not to brand. Their task is to hold those stakeholders to account. This is far too important to be left to government. This is far too important to be left to business. It's far too important to be left to civil society. Only a functioning coalition of all three can take on, in the very, very long term that it takes, the responsibility of managing that most precious asset of the country. It's good money. It belongs to the people, but it is in the custodianship of the government for its term in office. The role of an IMC is to hold them to task and say to them every 15 minutes, you're being boring, you're being boring, you're being boring. It won't work. That's all I have to say.